will ask more concrete questions eventually, but I like to leave it a little bit open to start if there's anything that people want to guide in their own direction, but. Yes, please.
I think I was interested in the first half in terms of like a bioethical lens, like what like culpability or responsibility. You know, like when he's driving his sister to the emergency room and then she hangs out of the window. Like who, like it seems to be an issue throughout the rest of the film. Who's responsible for this? I think that's an interesting, like, because he had no intent of killing, but he was acting recklessly. So does that, you know, does that give him culpability? Does that make him responsible? I guess it's also a question.
And the theme of responsibility and culpability also comes into play with these questions around mental health that we see in the movie too, right? So the slightly more concrete question I was going to ask next was about the conversation that that they have in Peter's classroom. The teacher asks, they're talking about Heracles, and he asks, you know, is it more or less tragic if he never had any control over the outcome of his life ever? And I don't know, I'd actually be curious if people did things come to mind when people, is it make it more or less tragic to have no control? Yeah. All right.
One of the students says that they think it's more tragic, right? Because there's no hope. But I think that it raises right to the, you know, it's great the way they do it, because you know, we've got he's getting texts, Peter, on his cell phone, and he's looking at the girls, but we're distracted from this kind of, you know, kind of leading comment in the text, but certainly this question of, you know, are these characters at all in control of anything that's happening in this family, right? So, and at the end, it sort of proposed, I suppose, that no, they had no control. This was all, you know, and some people see that as kind of a disappointing ending, that it's kind of landing on this place where, oh, it was the demon all along, right? Rather than the questions that are raised on the psychological and emotional level. But that question of blame and responsibility is running through that, and guilt. You know, I mean, you know, we get it so thickly from Annie, right? She's just carrying this incredible amount of guilt for a million things. When she's, for me, the hardest scene is when she's screaming at Peter at dinner and suggesting that it's not your fault, it is your fault, you know, and what she's doing is full of fault too in that very moment, right? So that idea of on the psychological level, right, that this is something that's coming generationally down, and she's carrying all this guilt for being a survivor, for encouraging Peter to take, or forcing Peter to take his sister to the party in the first place, and there's just levels of guilt that she's carrying around. And I think that for me, one of the questions that I'm still puzzling, I'd love to know what you guys think, is, you know, is Annie, you know, herself the central victim of the story in a way that, you know, and you know, that I feel like the first half of the movie certainly suggests that she's not somebody we like very much or approve of. She's quite absent with her family, and you know, we see her, you know, just as potentially a person causing harm, but at the same time we hear about the family she's grown up in and all of these, that she's a victim perpetrator, kind of.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear thoughts.
She cuts her own head off.
Yeah. Well, so Maura, you know, you said that some people are disappointed with the ending, that in the end it's just a demon, but it doesn't really have to be read that way, right? It could be read as it's all psychosis, and there's no demon at all. I don't know, I'm curious, how do people read that and interpret it? Was there a demon?
That's what, so I was curious about coming tonight, never seen the movie, never heard of it, and then we look it up and you're like, it's a horror movie, what are we gonna talk about here, or what's this gonna be about? So it was very interesting, and I'm coming this from the viewpoint of, I'm a clinical psychologist, but for most of the film, and I actually thought they did a decent job, which is hard to do, thought that they were portraying, or maybe they are, I don't people starting to become symptomatic with mental illness or psychosis in a very subtle, for most of the movie, I was like, this is not a horror movie. This is just, the horrific thing happens. It begins with an event of someone's death. It's very, very complicated to deal with the grief, etc. Plus then there's this family history apparently. So I was watching for, what's a dream, what's not, you don't know. What is maybe somebody just falling into the depths of a psychosis, and how frightening that is. And I've worked with a lot of patients who start to describe what a visual hallucination is like, really sat with them with things that can start to happen, especially towards the beginning, and how frightening it is. I actually thought they did sort of, again, not knowing what was going to happen. At the end, it's sort of a different thing, and that's the direction it went. And then I was like, oh, now it's a horror movie. Okay, now I see what's happening. And I was trying to figure it out, but I actually thought for much of it, that tension and sort of the subtlety and the dealing with the extreme trauma of the event and maybe some symptoms, I thought that's where that was sort of going. But
and I think the movie can operate completely on that level, right? I think you can actually, you're offered the story of the demon, but you can see it completely as none of it being real in the movie is all psychosis, or you can see it as it's all the demon or somewhere in the middle. Part of why I like the movie a lot.
I was just saying, I'm also a clinical psychologist by training, so I don't do a lot of clinical work, but I don't work with psychosis. Part of my takeaway was, and I had a similar experience of thinking it, I had read a little bit about the movie before I watched it, and I sort of got the impression that one of the central themes of this question about what is that one of the big questions as a viewer was going to be what is psychosis and what is really happening. That's a real horror, real paranormal experience that people are having with demons and witchcraft and whatnot. And as I watched it, I actually felt like, particularly the second half and the ending, that, but throughout actually, that if in some instances that to the extent that it is supposed to be portrayal of psychosis, that it is that's actually a little bit stigmatizing and kind of like there are aspects of it that certainly are accurate or could be read as accurate, but then it's also, even just like the idea of a horror film being the sort of horror core of the film being like the behavior of a potentially psychotic person is like a horror, it's like a stigmatizing trope, and these sort of association of like a person with does this person have a psychotic disorder, or are they possessed by a demon, like a early Christian or some kind of like ancient but not very modern or like very empathetic view of the person with psychotic disorder. And I also thought the questions about agency and blame versus responsibility are very interesting to as someone who thinks a lot about how people perceive the role of heredity in mental health. Just the question of when you use the word victim, is Annie a victim? And I think like that's often the sort of part of the impetus of the conventional wisdom to kind of promote the idea that psychiatric disorders are hereditary, is that people think it's destigmatizing because it'll suggest that it's really not your fault, and it's not just you're not just engaging in socially sanctioned behaviors by choice. But I think the question is our expression, like, is that more or less tragic, right? Do you really have? Are you just a victim then? Do you have no control? Is that better? So I thought it was very interesting in the way it raised those questions. But I think doing it in the context of a narrative that associates like kind of sort of like horror and use of violence is not necessarily my favorite.
I think that those are excellent points. Some of what we were talking about reminded me of a lot of the discussions around sort of sociogenomics as well. So happy to have you mention more about which populations you study particularly. My work, I do some research where I study how people who work in biotech companies think about the ethics of genomics, and one of the things I talk to them about is, you know, how they feel about studies around genetics and sexuality, and I've had quite a few people say, well, you know, if it I mean, one person I'm interviewing says, right, well, my son is gay, and if it's a gene, then it's destigmatizing, right? Or, you know, you hear that argument as well. And of course, those are well rehashed, you know, this kind of, obviously the stigmatizing the nature of hereditary genetic explanations of all sorts of social things. So.
We have 2 comments in the chat. So Ellen says, I also wonder if the idea of mental illness versus something so diabolical that's so stigma of illness being terrifying and dangerous. And then Helena says, maybe unpopular opinion, I didn't see psychosis with Charlie, just revenge.
On any of those comments, hard to hear.
Second one, can you,
Oh, sorry.
second one again?
It was maybe unpopular opinion. I didn't see psychosis with Charlie, just revenge and feelings of hope.
Character was sort of developed for less time at the beginning, but I don't more of you about to say
Yeah,
something.
just, I mean, one of the ways that I've thought about the film is about complicated trauma, you know, even if you, if you view the demon aspect as kind of a metaphor of a kind, for complex trauma or something, that the film could work that way without that. I loved what you said. That's so true about the question of how the film stigmatizes psychosis, and so I also have wondered about that reading, which the film opens itself to, I think, all these different readings, and the film, I think, also pushes us in an interesting way to suspect Annie, partially because of her sleepwalking as a kind of alibi in a way for wanting to kill her children. And so we're being pushed in a million different directions, and that's part of what makes the film so really disturbing, I think, as an experience. I mean, when you asked me to talk about this film, I thought, this film? You're asking people to watch this film. So, but I think there's a lot of, really, it sets so many lines in going at once, which is part of what makes it interesting.
Yeah, I also hesitated a bit, but I decided that I hope bioethics is tough, because there's a lot of really heavy things, and it's not all Hallmark movies. So with that.
Can I have a
Yes, please.
Can I share my video? I deeply resonated with the inevitable fate portrayed this movie. I'm a radiation oncologist, so I worked at the pharmaceutical company as a head of medical affairs. At that time, I was in charge of a drug for genetic disorders such as Fabry disease. So I know those kind of people. Some of them have hidden their diagnosis or treatments because they are worried that it might cause some problems with marriage or jobs. Yeah. So, however, some people make an effort to overcome their destiny. For example, Angelina Jolie took the plunge to undergo a post-breast mastectomy due to her inherited mutation BRCA.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's an interesting point because I think it's not so clear with psychiatric disorder to what extent people are seen as having options like that where they can really reduce their risk, or so in some cases it's not as clear what I mean. Some risk factors, there are some controllable risk factors that people know about and are clearly in personal control, but the genetics are not as clear cut as hereditary breast cancer associated with BRCA, or and neither are the sort of environmental and behavioral influences that can play a role. And like we were talking about before, if you have a family history that suggests an underlying kind of genetic diathesis, and the trauma or stress experience that precipitates like an acute episode is like an unexpected tragic death of your child, that's not so much something that is really under your control in the direct way that something like having mastectomy is, but well, it doesn't mean people still don't feel guilty about it.
Yeah, I think teasing out how different genetic basis of different sort of the penetration, et cetera, in terms of different genes is significant as we think about what genetics means for different kinds of traits and different kinds of disease. So, but I do think that your point, Anne, regarding is hiding hiding diagnosis gets to something I think in the film that also part of it, I think something that I like about the film is that there's also this kind of like, okay, well, there's the story that's like that there's mental health problems that run in this family. So then, the sleepwalking, we read that differently because we had this understanding of her family. And then we would if we hadn't been told that there was this family history of mental illness. And also like for Peter, for other like this kind of fear about I don't know how genetic or I don't know how heritable mental illness is. What does it mean for me that I have this family history? So I feel like there's a way, maybe I read it too strongly, but where you can see in that like maybe I'm reading it onto the film too much. But I think it's there that you have this like also fear of what I don't know what this means that it runs in my family.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's also interesting to think about what it means for something, particularly in middle kind of family. Because the title of the film is Hereditary, but just that there are multiple sources of familiality that are beyond just genetic inheritance. Of course, like psychotic disorders, the evidence we have suggests that there is a strong role of genetic heritability, but it's certainly not 100%, and it's when you get down to the level of an individual patient or individual family, it's even more complicated and difficult to keep that apart. And there also are, exposures, their traits can be familial because of people are passing things down through mechanisms other than genetics inheritance from one generation. And there's a suggestion that not to be partially without this film too.
Yeah, I think also this idea that maybe even magic is heritable, etc. Okay, I have some other questions, but maybe does anybody have one? Okay, so yeah. Or comments.
I took a different lens on like how, I guess this is a comment towards the stigmatization of the mother, I'm forgetting her name. Annie. I think like, I don't know if this is intentional, but the film to me does a great job of showing how we stigmatize particularly mothers and women who struggle with mental health issues or who struggle in general. Like we began with like, learning about this struggle, and throughout the whole movie, like she's clearly very vulnerable and susceptible to like whoever's coming up to her. She rolls down her window and lets a stranger invite her over to their house. We see this very vulnerable person, and yet it's framed in a way that we're not supposed to care. At the end, she's a monster. Like she cuts off her own head. She's a you know, deranged monster, even though we see how vulnerable she is and how much she's suffering. I think in a broader sense, it's kind of what we do to like mothers who suffer. Is like, you know, here are all of your faults and not like you're a very vulnerable person.
Yeah.
Who deserves to be like given grace.
Say something, I feel, like there really is a theme, a gender theme in the film that I will talk about, but. And my husband's also a psychologist and psychoanalyst, and we watched it together, he'd never seen it before. And, I asked him, what, you know, do you think that Annie was really trying to save what was left of her family? At the end? Was she, when she's saying, I love you, you're the love of my life, was that for real? And he said, yeah, that was his take.
Yeah.
That she was totally trying to save them. But that she couldn't. So that offers a slightly different read on that plot, but I think one can go. Absolutely. I mean, I didn't see it that way. I saw it more the way you see it, but it was interesting to hear this.
And I was kind of on this point too, the fact that she goes to the support group. And yet she, even at the end, like when her husband is asking, where have you been? And thinking that she's gone and done something that's sort of this nefarious kind of thing, but she's actually gone to this support group as she's grieving. And I wonder why she didn't admit that she had gone.
People have thoughts on why she might, I don't know either. But why she might share
I
that.
felt like the husband was a problem as
Yeah.
well. We haven't been discussed, but what I was gonna say to your point was, I'm a social worker with a bit of psychoanalytic training. And so I was thinking about the idea from like early psychoanalysis of like the schizophrenic mother that causes schizophrenia by just being like bad mom, which is like extremely prevalent here. Like it's just, you can see like almost handed down, and the fact that even the grandmother kind of latched on to Charlie, so it makes me think, oh, this poor girl maybe never even had a chance. Particularly with the breastfeeding, like I like paused on that miniature thing and was like, oh my god. I saw this movie before, but I don't remember that. Didn't remember that detail, but we haven't even discussed the dad, because he was, I don't even know his name. It's like he goes Steve, yeah, so
And he's
Yeah.
supposed to be a psychiatrist. Yeah.
I thought-
In the film, he's
Yes.
supposed to be. I think you get that only at the very beginning in that little like
There's
blurb.
this-
blurb.
Yes, but then there's also the scene where
Sending that
he's
email.
sending an email to a colleague saying
Yeah,
that
and the
I hesitate
email,
to write this, but
right.
my wife, I think, is in the midst of, and you don't see what
He
it is,
doesn't
but
finish
it's
it, yeah.
it's like psychotic episode, and the from and to email addresses are
Are
both
both,
like
yeah.
are the same domain. It's like it's like centralpsychiatry.com or something.
Oh, I always saw that too, and I thought he was writing to get help finally, and I didn't see the prompt, so I didn't realize. he was
Yeah.
like-
you can see how bad he was. I mean, the scene where they're fighting and he's like, come on, stop.
Well, it's weird. I was struck by that too in the film, thinking that in a family where one of the parents is a mental health practitioner, their son who went through this extremely traumatic event where his sister died right in front of him, and he clearly blames himself, got almost no support from his parents. They're, in fact, I mean, obviously they're going through a very difficult time too, but and he says at one point when she's at the support group talking about her family history of mental illness, she talks about how her mother had this disorder, her uncle had this disorder, and brother had this, and when she's talking about her mother, she says that her husband instituted no contact rule.
Right, yes.
Which I just thought was a very interesting, I mean, it's an interesting thing for psychiatrists to say, well, I'm washing my hands of this person who, at least in his conception, you can reach a severe psychiatric disorder, and you're not, and you shouldn't have any contact with her. You know, in some ways, the film could actually be read as sort of like an anti-psychiatry critique. If you know, there's like a theme where all these things, if all these people are desperate for help, or they're not getting it, and then something scary and supernatural and evil is happening, and if they're being gaslit and told that it's just psychosis, it's just I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but it's not a very sympathetic portrayal of psychiatrists. And
Yeah, I certainly think you have, I personally had a lot of sympathy for Annie. I'm like, just do the thing with her, like I really wanted him to just do the thing with her, although, try to flip back and forth. But, Maura, you were saying that, you felt like the first half of the film, Annie was really that sympathetic, which when you said that, I looked back and I was like, yes, yeah, that's fair. But I watching it twice, I totally understand what you're saying, but I didn't feel that way. But probably that's because of, some of my standpoints. Other comments? Well, we're talking about professions, Steve's profession, and then Annie is a miniatures artist. I'm wondering if maybe we could talk about that. Maura, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm like obsessed with miniatures. I really have always been obsessed with them, so I have like a ridiculous list of things to say about it. But please, please don't, stop me. But I mean, I think, the element of her trying to cope and control through this creation of these little dioramas of her traumas, that this meticulous labor that takes so much patience when she's a person full of anxiety and emotional disturbance. And in a way, when she's working, it's as if it's a form of dissociation. There's an element of that possibly, I don't know, or displacement activity, something like that. It doesn't feel like the same as sort of, I'm going to work through this by doing, it doesn't feel quite like
Right,
that.
it's not quite art therapy.
Right. And the idea that she's creating something that's accurate and objective, she says this is just an objective representation of our daughter's death. And that, as being quite a strange claim, but I think that miniatures are played with in such interesting ways in the film. I mean, that's my favorite part, actually. And how miniatures really can evoke very complex emotions in life, as in films, and they're often used in horror films. There's a poet, Susan Stewart, who caught my attention by talking about miniatures as evoking yearning. And when you look at them, but I think in this instance, the film is playing with the line between animate and inanimate, among other things. I mean, that remarkable opening where, I spent a long time studying those frames, like how is it that they're making the real rooms look like they're miniatures? And they put a lot of effort into that, had to have all kinds of things on the set, but also it's done with a lot of different techniques, including these very wide shots, keeping the characters at a distance so that they're sort of look doll size and all of that. But there's this element also, I think, of the uncanny and kind of this feeling of that miniatures can evoke also feelings of nostalgia and loss, and also of kind of a cognitive dissonance because they're in the wrong scale, and even the uncanny valley idea that they're a little bit too real, but then they're not quite real, there's all that, those things, and it also plays with another big horror film, technique, which is the voyeurism element. But thematically, I think it's also really profound, how it's playing out, and the idea that they're living in a dollhouse and that they are just kind of the playthings of fate or, heredity or whatever we want to call it. But I think also, as a woman's story, I think, the idea of the dollhouse. And, I think of Ibsen's The Dollhouse, right? But, there's all these elements in the film. When she's talking to, when Annie is talking to Charlie in that one sort of mother-daughter scene in the bedroom, and she says, when I was a tomboy, when I was little, like her daughter says, she wanted me to be a boy, and she wanted me to be a boy because the demon wants to be in the male body, right? So she wanted me to be a boy, but she doesn't pick up on that, right? And that idea also that gets in the classroom, the girl who Peter's interested in says it was his fault because he didn't pick up on the clues that were all, that were right in front of him. And we get that, one could read Annie that way too, that she didn't pick up on the clues, like she looks into that box and, she never looked into it before and what, all those things. But she says, I hated dresses and dolls and pink.
Yes.
And here she is making these dollhouses, and so this sense of the dollhouses as, representing her feeling about being a mother and being trapped in this life that she, she's an artist and so forth. And there's sort of like miniature crime scenes, which apparently there was a miniaturist whose job it was to create crime scenes for investigations. And there actually exists somewhere to be looked at. So anyway, those are, I could go on.
Oh, it's great to hear you talk about it. I love hearing that. I'm wondering as we're speaking whether I've just been lulled by this film because it's a beautiful film. But I don't know, thoughts on the miniatures.
She is a creator of miniature, but in reality, she is a miniature in the space created by Damon.
The last shot of the film, if you noticed it, is, where Peter's being bowed down to, they really make it look like a miniature that way. It's really like, totally, so this idea of them being sort of, the toys of gods or, some force that's out of their control is thematically emphasized in that way, bringing us back to
Yeah, maybe you could talk some more about gender. No, I had one comment about, Erin, did you, or some comments
Yeah,
from
it's
online,
comment.
sure.
Mary said that came to this movie via Midsummer with the same director, which was truly horrific and disturbing. Is it possible that the movie has at least an element of the supernatural, not all explained rationally by mental illness?
It's funny hearing. That's the last, just the last sentence.
Is it possible that this movie has an element, at least an element of the supernatural and not all explained rationally by mental illness?
I think we've certainly offered that option as viewers, right? I mean, it is such an interesting question. So many horror movies are working with sort of ordinary problems in life, real problems in life, just ramping them up and turning them into, giving them, I think this film makes me think back to Rosemary's Baby. Do you guys know that film? And the idea of somebody sort of well, we could talk about what's happening in that film, but it's not till the very end, as in this film, that you really are shown that there is this, and we don't know if it's real either, there is this actual coven and they're real, which is that question of do we see it as literal, or do we see it, as a kind of just a way of talking about something in a very ramped up way that creates a lot of emotion in us. And we'll say about horror films that they're different from other movies because what you experience as a viewer mirrors what the characters are experiencing, you know, that it is a real mirror of their experiences.
Yeah, Maureen, I'd be curious to hear you talk more about how you see this movie fitting into like horror.
Well, here. We've watched, I gotta go see and.
So I'm trying, tell me the password.
I think it's,
Oh, no, we changed it.
it fits nicely, it's.
Capital H explanation point.
And I'm not
It's
a
been
big
changed
horror
a million
fan,
fucking times.
so I don't have a great depth of knowledge, but I do feel like.
The dogs need to be babysat because I got.
The decision to, often horror movies will end with something that kind of calms you down, and then sometimes like the hand comes out of the grave. There's like a last turn that, you know, but maybe there are others in the room who are more expert in this field, but I feel like the decision to just make it so dark and so unredeemed at the end, you know, is surprises me. That there's, you know, that back.
Yeah, because like this point that I mean, spend a fair amount of the film not feeling like you're necessarily watching a horror film, is you know, I guess horror movies play with the genre plenty, but I think that's an interesting one to it. But I guess I don't know, I'm thinking to myself here, you know, how, as we're talking about gender in this film, how do we feel about it being a story that is directed by a man? Does that, do people feel like this is a negative representation of women?
I also made it the whole day without drugs.
Oh, good, I
I
I
didn't.
probably should have taken drugs,
land
but
on that thought
That's all right.
particularly,
It's-
it's produced by
That's what
Tony
was all mixed
Collette
up.
and Gabriel Byrne, you know, which is interesting that they really wanted to make the film, and he is so visually clever. I mean, remarkably visually clever, and
Yeah, she got all mad at me for being pissed, I was pissed.
uh,
Been fucking so much time, I don't have time for this shit.
Mind to me, although I was thinking about this question of, was there
my
an
phone is my
effort
remote,
to
I can't connect my
show
phone to my
a
computer without the
woman
internet.
trapped in a life that she didn't want, and that her mother pressured her to have children, and
You
that
should be
one
watching.
shot of the,
No, you can't with the
here
remote.
again, we get to the clues that she's putting together.
Press
Near
the
the
button.
end, and
They
there's
don't- it
a
only takes you so
picture
far.
of her mother standing in the doorway. And she's just staring at it, the camera holds on it for a long time, and you know, the possibility that her mother was like watching them have sex or something, I mean, you know, like what. You know, her kind of taking in her mother's incredible intrusiveness, so that point about maternal maternal monsters is certainly worth pausing over, I would say, and she's exposing her breast.
Is a little bit on this and also like how this relates to horror movies in general. Kind of gave me like a Heineke feel like Funny Games or The Piano Teacher, this distorted maternal relationship. Or like almost a play like we are so disturbed when we see her setting up the scene of the car crash, we're like that feels wrong. But then we're watching the setup of the scene of the car crash. So I think you also said earlier, like the voyeurism aspect of it, it's just, it feels very
Yeah,
consistent with like these.
and this conversation is also making me think about how Steve, dad, is made to look bad. Maybe that was to sort of blunt how bad the women are made to look, you know. Perhaps.
Yeah, I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm usually one to pick up when I think women are being, you know, given short shrift in a film, and I didn't really feel it from this. I think this conversation is significant for making me think about that a bit more. But I don't know, perhaps because I can think of other examples where the protagonists are all women and there are negative representations, but somehow the lack of a male who's being good, and also sort of focus on women in what doesn't, to me, feel purely negative. I don't know. Yeah, I'll have to toy with that a little bit more. Other people have more distilled thoughts about it, gender in the film. About whether it's a negative representation. It's very sarcastic.
There is,
No.
so I was gonna say, I mean, I thinking about it now, didn't necessarily first occur to me in watching the film, but thinking about it now, it could be read as a story where there's a lot of men being victimized by women. There's Peter is a big example, and he's like, you know, this group of women has had it out for him his whole life, and he didn't even know about it, but they blamed him again, including his own mother, potentially, where she made herself a little bit. But thinking about like the little bit that Annie says about her family, that her brother died by suicide and blamed it on his mother trying to put people inside him, which sounds a lot like what his mother was trying to do to other people in the movie.
Yeah.
And again, like it's sort of the kind of like medical gaslighting being come into play too. It's like, well, that would all just explain away by saying that he had schizophrenia, but maybe that he really was having, you know, people. And I don't remember exactly what they said about how his father died, but he had like psychotic depression. I guess it's not clear what role women may or may not have played freaking out about, I guess. But
She's a queen,
right.
the mother's a queen. No, doesn't look good.
They have all the power to do all.
Yeah, it struck me this time watching the film that at the end, there's this line about bind men to us as we are bound to you to pay them. There are men in not just a covenant, or I don't know, can be called a covenant, there are men in it. But there are men, but I did find that comment very striking this time. Because that's also something about witchcraft and their binding of men. Anyway. So, yeah.
Ellen says, I'm curious about the casting of the daughter. She was intentionally made to appear creepy, yet she ended up being a victim rather than a villain.
It's kind of a great, there are a lot of gestures like this in the film that what sort of does her in is her peanut allergy. Yeah. That she might be actually, I mean, as I understand the plot, she is carrying the demon in her, but he wants to be in a male body, so they have to get rid of her.
Yeah.
But the fact that she's carrying a demon, but she has a peanut allergy, is, kind of a striking dimension, and that actor who plays her is remarkable. So she, I mean,
is great. I think the acting in general is really, really good. I think that's also partially why I feel very attached to the film. Yeah, beautiful, really great acting. I think getting children to be well, there's lots of movies where children are creepy. Casting child actors who are creepy. I don't know. I saw there's creepy is not exactly right. Janet Planet is a great movie that came out last year and at New York Film Festival. Andy Baker, who's the director, talked about the casting and how difficult it was because most little girls who are setting acting films, are trying to be, cute and pleasing and etc. And it's very difficult to cast this really awkward, difficult child in Janet Planet.
Yeah, just a fun fact, the character, she actually was one of the original Matildas on Broadway.
Oh, from Janet Planet?
No,
from this. Okay.
Yeah.
She original.
Yeah, she
Oh, did she? Wow, interesting.
before.
Yeah, because that's very different role. Yeah, she's great in it. And I think, very generating of attachment. But one thing I didn't catch the first time I saw the film that I did today. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Mhm, yeah.
I was just gonna say, Yeah, I agree with casting that she's like uniquely, but also she has a disability, like a genetic disability. So it feels a little bit weird to me that they're like, oh, a strange looking character who acts weird and they casted a disabled child. So like, is this stigmatizing disability that like the creepy character is disabled?
Yeah, there's a lot written about that because there's a lot of defense of the film because this actor really wanted the role and felt she could really be great in it. And so this raises another really interesting ethical question, you know, for sure.
On this question of, well, so the lamp pole that decapitates Charlie has the witchcraft symbol on it, which I hadn't picked up on the first time. So this sort of getting rid, she needed to go in order to move it to a male body was something I hadn't fully. And then I also actually hadn't even picked up on it being Charlie's head on the mannequin in that last scene the first time that I saw it. So anyway. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I just taking the decapitation theme. I mean, linking it back to gender. I guess each generation of women has their heads removed. So I'm not sure what that signifies. And I know that saints are often depicted holding their own heads, and that's kind of martyrdom. I don't know. That makes them seem more saintly or
There's, if you, yeah, if you remember, there's a picture when Annie's looking through her mother's stuff. There's a book about this Paimon, however you say it, and in that drawing, he's got 3 heads that he's carrying. Did you catch that? And so, you know, but I think it is an interesting, you know, I mean, it's just so horrific. It's just, so, I mean, the scene of Peter lying in bed, waiting for his mother to find body. I mean, it's got some very effective, you know, horrors. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, you know, with the decapitation is right, so the head is sort of the seat of the brain, but also of psyche. Yeah, I think there's some sort of questions around where does the soul sit? Where does the person sit? Where does, at least for me, that was some of this, like, if the soul's moving and the questions around, you know, mental health, etc. To me, the head has some symbolism there. I don't have it exactly where
pigeon's head.
Pigeon's head.
Yes.
Other questions or comments?
It really bothered me that they were still driving around in the same car. Is that correct? Is that? So, like, I didn't, that just, I don't know, that was part of the horror of it all, but it was just, what was that?
So one of the interesting is the Damon skipped Annie's brother. Annie's brother died of some mental illness, schizophrenia, and then Annie's daughter, and then the brother. I think this story is about the journey of the Damon for their medium.
Although, I mean, I thought I had listening to her describe how the brother died from suicide after experiencing what was called schizophrenia, but she described this hallucination or his delusion as being that mother was trying to put people inside, which it read in the copies of the rest of the film. A possible reading about is that what really was happening is that he was being tormented by his mother in an effort to like find a voice for this demon, and that's why he killed himself, or that maybe he didn't even kill himself. But
Right, so that's the Peter killed himself.
right. I think we only hear a little snippet about the rest of it. It's just enough to like raise the question about the hereditary nature of the patterns, whatever this is supposed to be through the course of the generations.
Yeah. Other comments or questions?
I was thinking about the spirituality lens of that movie, because there was a scene where she was figuring out what was the lore behind what's happening and happening. But then there was this book called Notes on Spirituality, and I felt that was super reductionist. And then they were looking through the book, and I think it was Sanskrit.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah.
So I felt that was kind of like a negative connotation of non-Western religions or institutions, and the way that they also performing the ritual was somewhat similar to how Muslims pray too, because they prostrate like the way that they did. So I felt a bit off in that scene, because like we pray the same way too. So I'm wondering if perhaps, I don't know, that could be like a future ethical review of like future horror movies.
Sorry, say more about that last bit.
Oh, like because I don't know, because maybe like the Sanskrit part and also the fact that they were prostrating, it gives me a very uncomfortable feeling. Because like I do it for my religious reasons, but they're doing it in a more like demonic state.
And that you're saying it's you think it's a negative representation. I just wasn't sure whether what you were saying about future horror.
That's a great point.
Yes.
And I also feel like the positions that they're in, can't see their, going back to the heads. You know, it's like they're just bodies, and the whole business of naked men is interesting. Like we don't see naked women, it's naked men. But I just really think that's a really interesting point, and want to give more thought to.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about also how much at that point she says we reject the Trinity. So there, I'm not really sure how. I'm trying to think about how those might relate. Certainly, there's a this idea it's a pagan religion, but non-Christian Trinity certainly. But I think yes, I also. They say multiple times, we don't know which Notes on Spiritualism, or it looks to me like it was in Sanskrit. But then the incantation, which we never hear, is said twice. What language is that even?
That's second line.
Weird. You know, either say what language or not.
Maybe I wondered if like maybe originally it was, if there was, we were supposed to hear it and then they cut it out.
Yeah,
because of
seems a
words
little
like this. And then that struck me as odd as well.
I think I read, but who knows, I mean, I did read that the words that were written on the wall, that, you know, and that the friend who's the other, you know, who's the brings her to the seance, Joni, right? That she screams at Peter, that those were actual terms in this, you know, kind of demonic, you know, that they have a history, those terms, sazosi or something, I forget what they were, but and you know, and Annie very carefully puts them into the miniature.
Right. On the wall.
Yeah, but it is sort of female dominated in a way that yeah, I mean, it's just interesting.
At the same time, it's Black female dominated. I agree with that, but I was thinking like, why the women cannot hold the female body? Why it has to be a man? So I think it's just some thoughts. You know, I hear thoughts. So I think the individuals feel this like domination between the genders, or
yeah, Charlie seems to present it.
yeah.
That was sort of, yeah.
I know we're gonna wrap up pretty soon, but Matt, I'm curious, at least early on, I was asking kind of what your thoughts were on this representation of mental illness in this film, and I wondered if through our conversation, has that changed at all, or also sort of, you know, I really liked the idea that you gave about this kind of sort of gaslighting from psychiatry anyway, but I'm curious if you think overwhelmingly this is a, you know, would you say, oh, I think this stuff is really a problem in the messages it gives for about mental health?
Well, you know, it's a complicated question because we don't actually know whether anyone we're seeing in the movie is experiencing right disorder or not. And there's and even if they're not, there's multiple readings of what that means, in what way they're not also. But you know, I think to the extent that it is supposed to be a representation of like how people with psychosis behave, I think it's not very.
It's that, yes,
it's stigmatizing. But and just the association with mental health disorders with horror in general and violence.
That very fact
is
is probably sufficient to be
it's a little problematic,
Yeah.
but it is also, you know, raising questions that to the extent that you see it as a metaphor, it's raising questions about issues.
As we wrap up, do either of you two have anything left that you wanted to get out there?
So, yeah.
No, I guess I'm curious, you know, just the question of the indeterminacy of the story, you know, that is that did you think that was a plus, you know, in a way, or you know what I mean, that question of getting all these, in a way, it gets your mind going in all these different directions while you're watching it, right? Like you're going this way and that way, it means this, it means that, so it's very activating to have all these different possibilities for what's actually happening to these characters. So, and that's, I think, part of the, you know, again, it's a complicated viewing experience, yeah.
Yeah, did anyone have any strong feelings about whether they were pro or they liked that enriched their experience, or was it frustrating that it can be read too many ways?
It is great because it gives many possibilities. So you can interpret it in the form that you want to and have discussions like we are having here. So
Certainly leads to discussion, but all right, well, I think we're closing up now. Thank you so much to our really wonderful panelists, also to everyone here for joining in. Thank you. The Division of Ethics is hosting an Ethics Grand Round event on March 11th. That's going to be about migrant health. We'd love for you to join us for that, and also to subscribe to our mailing list. For folks online, you'll get information about that in the chat now. Also, when you guys sign off, there will be a evaluation that pops up, and that we really use that in thinking about how we run this series. So we really would love if people would fill that out. So thank you everyone so much, and I look forward to talking to you all more.